January 3rd, 2026. 3:47 a.m. Caracas, Venezuela. Explosions light up the Caracas Valley. U.S. Special Forces, under orders from President Donald Trump, launch a coordinated strike on the Venezuelan capital. Their target, President Nicolás Maduro. By dawn, Maduro and his wife are in U.S. custody, bound for New York City to face drug trafficking charges. Trump's words are unambiguous. We're going to run the country. A sitting head of state, captured by a foreign military, his nation's sovereignty suspended indefinitely. But this story didn't begin on January 3rd, 2026. To understand how we arrived at this moment, we need to understand two intersecting histories. One stretches back 70 years, the other just 27. This is the story of how a revolutionary dream collided with an old pattern of power. 1954, Guatemala. The democratically elected president, Jacobo Arbenz, implements land reforms that threaten United Fruit Company's holdings. The CIA orchestrates a coup. Arbenz flees. A military dictatorship takes his place. 1973. Chile. Salvador Allende's socialist government is overthrown in a CIA-backed military coup. Thousands die in the aftermath. 1974. Grenada. US forces invade, removing a Marxist government in an operation that lasts days. 1975. Panama. 27,000 US troops invade to capture Manuel Noriega, who faces drug trafficking charges in Florida. Sound familiar? For 7 decades, this pattern repeated across Latin America. The justifications evolved: anti-communism during the Cold War, drugs in the 1980s and 90s, terrorism after 2001. But the pattern remained consistent. When a Latin American government challenged US interests or became too problematic, Washington intervened. Sometimes covertly, through intelligence agencies and proxy forces, sometimes overtly, with overwhelming military force. The methods varied. The outcome was often the same: regime change. By the late 1990s, this pattern seemed to be fading. The Cold War was over. Democracy was spreading. Latin America was asserting independence. And then, in Venezuela, a former army officer with a vision began to challenge everything. February 4th, 1992. Lieutenant Colonel Hugo Chávez leads a failed military coup against Venezuela's government. He's captured, imprisoned, but his televised surrender makes him a folk hero. His words resonate. For now, we have not succeeded. For now. 6 years later, Chávez wins the presidency democratically with 56% of the vote. His promise, a Bolivarian Revolution named after Simón Bolívar, the liberator who freed much of South America from Spanish rule 2 centuries earlier. Chávez's vision was ambitious. 21st century socialism, wealth redistribution, regional integration independent of Washington. He called George W. Bush the devil at the United Nations. He built alliances with Cuba, Iran, Russia, China. He positioned Venezuela as the leader of a new Latin American left, and for a while, it worked. Venezuela had something that made all of this possible: oil. Not just any oil, the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. And in the 2000s, oil prices soared. From $20 a barrel in 1999 to over $140 by 2008, Chávez poured money into social programs, literacy campaigns, healthcare, housing. Poverty rates dropped. His supporters loved him. To them, he was finally making Venezuela's oil wealth work for ordinary people, not just the elite. But Chávez also centralized power. He extended presidential term limits. He nationalized industries. He shut down opposition media. He built a political machine loyal to him personally. When oil prices were high, he could paper over the cracks. When they fell, everything began to fracture. March 5th, 2013. Hugo Chávez dies of cancer. His designated successor, Nicolás Maduro, narrowly wins the presidency by just 1.5%. Maduro inherited Chávez's system, but he didn't inherit his charisma, his political skill, or his timing. 2014. Oil prices collapse from over $100 a barrel to below $30. Venezuela's economy, dependent on oil for 95% of export revenue, implodes. Maduro's response was to double down on Chávez's policies without Chávez's ability to maintain support. Inflation spiraled into hyperinflation. At its peak, prices doubling every 19 days. Store shelves emptied, medicine vanished. The currency became worthless. People began dying from preventable diseases. Malnutrition spiked, and Venezuelans began to leave. First thousands, then millions. By 2025, nearly 8 million Venezuelans, a quarter of the population, had fled the country. As the crisis deepened, Maduro became more authoritarian. Opposition leaders were jailed or exiled. Protests were violently suppressed. Elections were manipulated. The National Assembly was stripped of power and replaced with a constituent assembly loyal to Maduro. July 28, 2024. Presidential elections. The opposition, united behind María Corina Machado's movement, believes this is their moment. Exit polls and independent tallies suggest a landslide victory against Maduro. The government-controlled Electoral Council announces Maduro has won with 51% of the vote. They refuse to release detailed precinct-level results. The opposition cries fraud. Protests erupt. Maduro's security forces crack down. Dozens die. The United States, European Union, and most Latin American nations refuse to recognize the results. But Maduro remains in power, backed by the military, the intelligence services, and Venezuela's remnants of state institutions. The Bolivarian Revolution, launched with promises of dignity and independence, had become a hollowed-out authoritarian regime clinging to power as its country collapsed around it. It had promised to resist US influence. Instead, its failures would create the perfect conditions for the most direct US intervention in Latin America in decades. For Donald Trump, Venezuela represented everything he wanted to demonstrate about American power: a socialist failure, a drug trafficking hub, a migration crisis affecting the US border. And underneath it all, oil. Those massive oil reserves, largely untapped under Maduro due to mismanagement and sanctions. Trump had long-eyed Venezuela's resources. In his first term, he had mused about military options. His officials dismissed it. Too risky, too complicated. But in his second term, with fewer constraints and emboldened by earlier actions, Trump began to escalate. December 2024. Naval blockade tightens. Trump calls it quarantine. Late December. First drone strike on Venezuelan port facilities. Early January 2026. Strikes intensify. Communications infrastructure, military depots, missile systems. Behind the scenes, the CIA had cultivated something crucial, a source inside Venezuela's government. Someone with access to Maduro's movements, his security protocols, his vulnerabilities. January 3rd, 2026. The pieces were in place. 3:47 a.m., explosions rock Caracas as US forces take out air defense systems and communications nodes. Special Forces helicopters, likely launched from US naval vessels off the coast, move toward their target. Within hours, Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores, are in US custody. The operation mirrors the 1989 Panama invasion that captured Manuel Noriega, but faster, more surgical, enabled by modern technology and inside intelligence. Trump addresses the nation. We're going to run the country. They've got a lot of oil. We're going to make sure it's managed properly until we can establish a permanent replacement. The legal justification: Maduro faces charges of narco-terrorism, drug trafficking, and weapons violations. The US has accused him of turning Venezuela into a narco state, using drug proceeds to maintain power and destabilize the region. Maduro had always denied direct involvement in drug trafficking, though the accusations were long-standing and well documented by US agencies. The international response splits predictably. US allies express cautious support or silence. Russia demands Maduro's release, calling it kidnapping. China condemns the violation of sovereignty. The UN Secretary-General warns of a dangerous precedent. Across Latin America, the reactions are mixed. Some governments, exhausted by the Venezuelan refugee crisis, quietly welcome it. Others condemn it as imperialism. The ghost of past interventions haunts every statement. In Miami, Bogotá, Lima, Madrid, anywhere Venezuelan exiles have settled, crowds celebrate in the streets. After years of watching their country collapse from afar, they see hope. But in Caracas itself, the mood is more complicated. "I at least can see some light at the end of the tunnel again," one Caracas resident tells the BBC. She's grateful Maduro is gone, but she won't give her real name. Because in Caracas, danger still lingers. Maduro's supporters rally in the streets, demanding his release. The National Assembly, still dominated by his loyalists, had weeks earlier passed a law declaring anyone who supports US actions a traitor. Pro-government paramilitary groups, the colectivos, patrol neighborhoods with weapons. "It makes you a bit afraid to even go out to buy bread right now," another Venezuelan says. And then there's Diosdado Cabello, Maduro's Minister of Interior and longtime power broker. "He is a very bad person, very spiteful," one resident warns. "I don't know how many people he has on his side." The Venezuelan military, the institution that kept Maduro in power, remains largely intact. Will they accept US occupation? Will they resist? Will they fracture? Trump says the US will manage Venezuela's oil and run the country until a replacement can be found. But there's no clear plan, no timeline, no obvious successor with legitimacy. The opposition that won the 2024 election lacks the power to simply take control. Years of exile, imprisonment, and repression have fractured their movement. And what of the 8 million Venezuelans in exile? Will they return? Can they return? Their country has been traumatized by years of crisis. Maduro's removal doesn't undo that damage. History offers sobering lessons. Panama after Noriega faced years of instability. Iraq after Saddam fell into civil war. Nation building is bloody, expensive, and often fails. Venezuela sits at a geopolitical crossroads. Russia has military advisors there. China has invested billions. Any US presence will be contested, not just locally, but globally. And that oil, Venezuela's blessing and curse, will drive every decision. Who controls it? Who profits from it? American companies are already being promised access. But Venezuelan oil infrastructure is degraded after years of mismanagement. Rebuilding it will take years and billions of dollars. So what makes January 3rd, 2026 different from December 20th, 1989, when US forces invaded Panama to capture Noriega? The scale is smaller, surgical strikes instead of a full invasion. The technology is more advanced, drones, cyber warfare, precision intelligence. The justification is similar, drug trafficking, though now coupled with broader narco-terrorism charges. But the fundamental dynamic is the same, a hemispheric power removing a leader it deemed illegitimate, using military force to impose its will. Every generation thinks their intervention will be different, more justified, more successful, more legitimate. Guatemala was about protecting American business interests, wrapped in anti-communist rhetoric. It led to decades of civil war and genocide. Chile was about stopping socialism. It brought Pinochet and disappeared thousands. Grenada was quick, decisive, and largely forgotten, but it emboldened future interventions. Panama seemed successful. Noriega faced trial. Democracy was restored. But it took years and left deep scars. Venezuela in 2026 faces all of these legacies at once. A collapsed economy like Guatemala's aftermath. Political polarization like Chile's trauma. The speed of Grenada's invasion with the complexity of Panama's reconstruction. And unlike any previous intervention, it's happening in an age of instant global communication, where every decision, Every drone strike, every civilian casualty will be documented, debated, and weaponized. The people of Venezuela didn't ask for Maduro, but they didn't ask for US occupation either. For years, the international community watched as their country collapsed, as millions fled, as democracy died. No country had previously heard the cry of Venezuelans in the face of this tragedy. One Venezuelan tells the BBC after Maduro's capture. Now the world is watching. The question is, what happens next? The Bolivarian Revolution promised to break the pattern, to build a Latin American socialism that could resist US influence and empower the poor. For a time, high oil prices made it seem possible, but Chavismo became the thing it claimed to oppose: authoritarian, corrupt, indifferent to suffering. It hollowed out Venezuela's institutions, drove millions into exile, and created the conditions for its own collapse. And so the old pattern returned, stronger than ever, more overt than it had been in decades. This is only the beginning, one Venezuelan says. We know there is still a long road ahead. That road is uncertain. Venezuela's oil will flow again. But to whose benefit? Democracy might return. But in what form? Stability could come. But at what cost? Simón Bolívar, whose name inspired Chávez's revolution, once said, "A people that loves freedom will in the end be free." The Venezuelan people have survived Spanish colonialism, military dictatorships, and the collapse of their Bolivarian dream. Now they face something both new and old: liberation at the barrel of a foreign gun, carrying the weight of 70 years of history and all of its unresolved questions. The capture of Nicolás Maduro marks the end of one chapter. But as the sun rises over Caracas on January 4, 2026, the hardest chapters may still be ahead.